Bringing you the latest in tax credit news, this is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the July 18th, 2023 podcast. One of the most important annual events for owners and investors in affordable housing properties is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's, or HUD's, release of income limits. Property owners use HUD's income limits to calculate the maximum annual income a family can have and still be eligible to occupy HUD-assisted and low-income housing tax credit-financed housing. The limits are also used by owners of tax credit housing to determine the maximum rent that tenants can be charged. For the last 2 years, one of the most impactful factors has been the national cap. The national cap is the maximum percentage that income and correspondingly rent limits can increase for a given year. 1 year ago, HUD changed the formula. Just over a year ago, HUD changed the formula that they use to calculate the cap, which is the central topic that we're going to discuss in today's podcast. Many in the tax credit housing community expected HUD to revert back in 2023 to the formula for calculating the cap that they had used before last year, the cap formula used before 2022. HUD did not revert back. Instead, HUD chose to use the same formula for the cap in 2023 that it used in 2022. I think it's also worth noting that before 2022, the methodology that HUD used for the cap was the same for the previous 12 years. That is why this year, when the income limits and cap were announced by HUD on May 15th, they did come as a surprise. As we discussed in a podcast at that time, the 2023 figures came in significantly lower than many affordable housing stakeholders expect. Now, nominally, you may be asking yourself, what is the cap for 2023? For 2023, the cap is 5.92%. As such, the maximum increase in the limit for any area is 5.92%. And you probably recognize that that figure is lower than the average rate of inflation for the past year or so. Now, let me share some background on for the 12 years before 2022, HUD calculated the cap using the same inputs that it uses when calculating area median income. They would take the National American Community Survey data and trend it forward using the change in the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. It then compared the change in this calculated national median income adjusted by CPI over the prior year's national median income adjusted for CPI to determine the cap. However, in 2022, HUD altered the formula and they removed the CPI factor. And instead, HUD only used the annualized change in American Community Survey data for national median income for 2018 to 2019. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for 2023, the cap is 5.92%. And as I also noted, below the rate of inflation over the past year or so. While under the pre-2022 formula, that percentage cap would have been about 14%. Now, in May, my partner, Thomas Stagg, was a guest on the podcast to discuss the meanings and implications of the 2023 rent and income limits. Thomas also wrote a blog post and an article for the Novogradac Journal of Tax Credits about this year's limits. And I will put links in today's podcast show notes to those articles and to the blog post. Now, today, Thomas will be back to talk about a bigger picture question, one that's the topic of a column that Thomas and I co-wrote for this month's Novogradac Journal of Tax Credits. That column traces the history of the cap and whether HUD should change the formula it uses to determine the income limits cap. We address the question of whether it makes sense for HUD to have a more consistent and public method that's going to use to calculate the cap. Thomas is one of the most frequent guests on Tax Credit Tuesday, and in my view, is the nation's leading expert on written income limits outside of HUD. Yeah, I did say that. I believe he's the nation's leading expert outside of HUD. Now, Thomas is a key player in creating and updating the Novogradac Written Income Limit Estimator and is also the leader of our Income Limits Working Group. More about that in a bit. Thomas does work out of Novogadac's Metro Seattle office, where he focuses on a broad range of clients, including many affordable housing stakeholders. Now, in today's podcast, Thomas and I will discuss what was expected with respect to income limits release and what actually happened regarding the income limits release. We'll also look at the history of income limits and most notably the history of the cap, as well as discuss some of the presumptions as to why a cap exists. We'll talk about how the cap affects the feasibility of affordable housing, and we'll also look at what to expect going forward. And with time, we'll discuss some of the alternative methods HUD could use to calculate the cap. As you can tell, we've got a lot to discuss today. So if you're ready, let's get started. So Thomas, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be back.
And hope I didn't embarrass you by calling you the leading expert outside of HUD on income and rent limits.
Well, I think it's not the first time you've said that this year, so I'm used to it now.
It is not. So I would like to level set with listeners before we get into the more significant part of the podcast dealing with the cap, but have you give an overview of what happened with respect to 2023 income limits as compared to what many owners and investors expected.
Yeah. So again, similar to last year, it was a year where income limits saw large increases across the country. Most areas were up. In fact, only about 2% of areas had decreases. So all in all, it was fairly good news for increases. If we look at area median income, the average change was right around 10%. But for tax credit programs, we use what's called very low income, or as I'll refer to it as VLI. Now, VLI, HUD has some adjustments that they make, and the cap is one of those. And so when we look after HUD did these various adjustments, the average change in VLI was 5.45%. And that's mainly, so we look at that difference between AMI of 10% and VLI of 5.45%. And that's mainly due to this cap. And the cap impacted about 85% of areas. And when we looked at kind of doing projections, and like you mentioned earlier, that HUD would likely go back to the historical method of calculating the cap, we expected the cap to be closer to 14%. And so if the cap was at 14%, it would have resulted in about 16% of areas being capped. So very in line with kind of historically what we've seen with number of areas capped and how the cap would have been calculated. But that's not what happened, of course. And that's why we're here to talk about, what prompted this change? Why were so many areas capped?
So thank you for that. And when we think of the cap, as I mentioned in the intro, the cap ends up affecting the income levels. The max income levels tenants can have and still qualify for tax credit housing. And it also affects the maximum rent that an owner of tax credit housing can charge for a given unit. But as we discussed in preparing for the podcast, those aren't the only two items that the cap indirectly affects. So if you could share with the listeners some of the other areas that the cap ends up affecting.
I think the biggest one that'll be of interest to our listeners is the impact to DDAs and QCTs. The HUD income limits indirectly are a component of each of those calculations. So it changes what areas qualify, or it could change, right? Which areas qualify for DDA and QCT, but also impacts a lot of other programs that we don't normally think about. The tax exempt mortgage revenue bonds for home ownership financing. So people trying to qualify for bonds for home ownership, and eligibility for disability income support payments to certain veterans. And I think kind of even more importantly to the projects that we're kind of working on, right up there, QCTs and DDAs, is it impacts supportable debt for new projects, which of course, when we think about rent limits, that's probably already included there, but I just wanted to make sure that we mention that that is kind of this indirect impact of these capped limits.
So when I think about the cap and the 5.92%, as I noted in the intro, the fact that it was below the rate of inflation for 2022 is pretty significant for the long-term viability of tax credit properties. But before we talk about some of the other issues here, I thought it would be worthwhile taking a bit of a walk back in time. Because I mentioned in my intro that before 2022, when the methodology was changed, before 2022, the methodology for determining the national cap was unchanged for 12 years, which begs the question that if I look back 12 years from 2022 and I'm at 2010, what happened to 2010? And maybe you could address that in terms of the sort of, where the cap was in 2010 or the concept of cap.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to go back even 2 years earlier to 2008, and that's when the Housing and Economic Recovery Act passed. And part of the Housing and Economic Recovery Act, it instituted this new project-specific hold harmless test for tax credit projects. So basically now tax credit projects, once it's in service, its income and rent limits will never decrease. And once that happened, HUD said, "Hey guys, we've been implementing this hold harmless policy for Section 8 income limits primarily to not harm low income housing tax credit projects." And so after HERA was passed in October of 2009, HUD issued uh, a request for comments on discontinuing the hold harmless policy. And in HUD's notice, they said this policy is commonly referred to as the hold harmless policy was implemented to avoid jeopardizing the financial feasibility of existing housing projects in instances where program rents were tied to Section 8 income limits, i.e., low income housing tax credits. That was me adding the i.e. Section 8 income limits have been maintained at the same level until such a time as income limit calculations produced increases. So HUD mainly was doing this hold harmless to benefit tax credit projects, but they didn't really like it because they felt that holding it harmless meant that tenants who truly needed the assistance maybe were getting crowded out by tenants who didn't actually need assistance because they were above the actual income limits for the area without the hold harmless policy. So HUD asked for comments on this and to discontinue the hold harmless policy. And they specifically asked for comments on discontinue the hold harmless policy. And if they did do it, what they should do about home rents, because home rents are a program controlled by HUD, where the rents are at least partially influenced by the HUD income limits. But they didn't ask any specific comments related to if they should do a floor or cap on this. So the first time we hear about the floor or cap was when HUD contemporaneously released their uh, findings or what they were going to do in relationship to discontinuing the hold harmless policy when they contemporaneously released that with the 2010 income limits in May of 2010. So HUD issues their final notice. They had received 24 comments on the notice of discontinue hold harmless. I would like to think now that we as an industry are so much more savvy that if this happened now, they would receive 2,000 comments potentially. I don't know, but definitely more than 24. But this was the first time that caps on increases and decreases were specifically mentioned. And it was interesting kind of reading through this to get into HUD's mind as to why they felt that a cap was needed. And there's a couple of quotes I'm going to pull from that final notice I think are interesting. The first one says, "The current hold harmless policy allows for any increase, and there have been increases over 5% from time to time. Large increases are no better for the affordable housing program than large decreases." So we start to see this hint that HUD doesn't really like large increases in income limits. Uh, Continuing, HUD's goal with this change is to provide more manageable rent increases by capping increases to the maximum 5% or twice the change in national median income. So again, we see that HUD is saying that they are trying to make more manageable rent increases for tenants, and that there is some kind of uh, thought here that large rent increases are bad for tenants. And then finally, the hold harmless policy did not limit large increases, and this did prove harmful for tenants. So we see that if you kind of read between the lines here and look at this, you kind of see that I think at first we thought that the caps were really trying to catch data outliers. And that's kind of what we look at the first 10 years. That's what you see, about 10% of the areas are capped. And so those tend to be data outliers, like large swings that maybe it was just a bad survey that year. And so HUD's trying to protect, we all kind of thought HUD was trying to protect against that. But when you go back and read, you see that all along HUD was concerned about these large year over year increases. But you know what this policy doesn't do is it doesn't really tell us what HUD considers a manageable or allowable increase. And I'm maybe getting ahead of some of our questions there, but I think it's interesting that that 2 times change in national median income figure, I think was HUD kind of saying, well, if we get into really inflationary time periods, greater than 5% might be reasonable, but in low inflation time period, 5% is probably a good number. Um,
Right.
yeah, so it's kind of interesting look back here to see where that cap originally came from and kind of what caused it. And I really think this is an unintended consequence of the HERA regulation, because I don't think people really thought that the HERA would instantly kind of lead HUD to do away with its hold harmless policy.
You're right. Do away with the hold harmless policy or institute caps.
Yeah, or definitely not instant caps. That's right. That is for sure.
And I would just remind listeners that the HERA change was because the previous approach to calculating area median income limits was done in a fashion that was based upon the decennial census, and had found in 2000 that once that data was available, which is obviously a few years after 2000, that the projected increases in area median incomes were, across the nation, many areas were substantially higher than what the decennial census showed. So there was going to be a period of time where a lot of areas weren't going to see any income increases. Obviously, from a sustainability of the operation of property with rising operating expenses every year, that wasn't viable. And that's what led to the HERA change that created these HERA special type units. And there's more about that in the article that Thomas and I co-wrote. So I don't know if you wanted to say anything more to that, Thomas, or we can move on.
I think we can move on.
Because that's ancient history. That hasn't too much relevance to today. But
Yeah.
in reference to the era, I wanted to uh, build out that a little bit more. But let's now turn to 2022, because I haven't been able to find any written guidance where HUD specifically says why they changed the CAP methodology in 2022. So I thought I'd ask you to share your thinking behind why HUD changed methodology in 2022. And if you have any other thoughts about the original imposition of HUD and why they created the CAP, share those as well, but more focused on why the CAP methodology changed in 2022.
Yeah. So I think to me, it comes back to kind of what we read in that final notice from HUD, where they talk about they think large increases are harmful. And so when we look at 2022, under the old cap methodology, the cap would have been 25%. Now, granted, the cap for 2022 was still 11.89%. So I'm not sure where HUD draws the line at large increases. But I think that there was a little bit of discomfort with, especially 2022 coming right off of the pandemic, that having increases of 25% would have been seen as too large and too large for tenants to handle. But I think what was so surprising is we flash forward to 2024, we thought, well, 2022 was this weird year. The big increases were largely caused by this huge inflation spike, with HUD trending the ACS data for with inflation. So we thought 2023 we'd get back to normal. And when we do the calculation, we see that the increase under the old methodology was 14%. And now if I'm just looking at the numbers and saying, how different is 14% versus 11.89%? They don't seem that different. So it seems though that's why I think a lot of us thought that HUD would go back to the previous method, and that 2022 is such an outlier with this 25% increase that we'd be back to kind of this traditional method of calculating it. But of course they didn't. And, like you said, I haven't seen anything in writing from HUD on this, but HUD did speak at NCSHA, and they mentioned that part of the reason, so the question came up there, it said, hey guys, you're capping 55% of the areas last year, 85% of the areas this year. Is this cap really correct? Is this right? And one reason why they said that they think the cap might be right is that they are concerned that the CPI trend factor is trending incomes faster than actual incomes are growing. So if they had trended at inflation during 22 and 23 without the use of the cap, that in 24, when we get the 2022 ACS data, and they do their 24 calculation, that there might be another re-benchmarking, and HUD wants to avoid that. And so part of the reason why they've instituted the cap is to make it so is because they think that CPI is growing faster than incomes. And so it's served to kind of slow that down a little bit. And I think that, again, if we look at if we read between the lines, I think HUD is worried about large increases in rent. And so I don't know, I don't want to say this happened directly, but I think there was probably some pressure to figure out a way to tweak the cap so that use kind of the same uh, wording, right? Our change in national median income, we're just changing how we calculate national median income for the cap, but find a way to tweak it so that the increases were slowed down during this period coming off of the COVID pandemic.
Thank you for that, Thomas. I will also give you a bit of kudos, because while there's a general belief that in 2023, how to revert back to the pre-2022 approach, I do remember on lots of the discussions we had, the income limits working group and the rest, you did include, if they kept the 2022 methodology, it would be about 6%. So it wasn't as if it wasn't considered as a possibility, it just wasn't the expectation.
Right.
So in the column that we co-wrote, we also note that the lack of predictability, when I say lack of predictability, I mean the fact that the methodology changed in 2022, it definitely came as a surprise. The fact that in 2023, 2022 is being used. Now for 2024, we don't know if 2022 will be used before the methodology before 22, they'll revert back to. So this lack of predictability as to the national cap, we note in the article that we co-wrote that it limits affordable housing development. And I thought it'd be useful if you share with listeners why that's so.
Yeah. Well, first I want to say that, HUD again at NCSHA, so, it's not publicly written down anywhere, but they did kind of hint that they would likely use the same cap for 2024. But I think our concern is that HUD has now kind of shown that they want to use this cap as a way to avoid large increases. And so we kind of sit here and say, well, okay, we know what they did for the last 2 years. We can calculate that way next year. But how do we know that if that ACS data shows a large increase, and so therefore the cap under the new methodology is larger, that they won't continue to meddle in some way and say, okay, the ACS data now says 25%. Let's revert back to a different way that shows a 10% increase. And so it creates this question about what is an acceptable level of increase for HUD? Because we sit here and we look at the inputs that we can calculate and we say, okay, under this methodology, the cap is X, but we're just now in the back of our minds, we're always going to have to think, is HUD going to step in and further tweak this cap methodology? And that causes uncertainty, right? And anytime we have uncertainty in this industry, we gravitate to the most conservative answer, right? And so when we have uncertainty added to our underwriting has to become more conservative. When we have uncertainty in light of how this is going to impact DDAs and QCTs, we have to have more uncertainty in our underwriting and therefore more conservativeness. And so that's really, I think, what's causing that's what I think our root issues with the cap. And we don't think that 5.92 is a wrong number or a bad number. It's the fact that we don't know for sure what that number is going to be going forward. And when I look at the income limit calculation outside the cap, it's very formulaic. It's been very consistent for a long time. Now, HUD has tweaked the calculation as they've gotten better data, right? Going from the census data to the ACS data, et cetera. But all those tweaks were mainly done to use more relevant and better data. And so they all kind of made sense to us. And it's result in this very formulaic calculation. But now after we do all the formulaic calculation, we have this uncertain question on the end as to, is this too big of an increase? And when we have that, it just causes, as I said, uncertainty and therefore conservativeness.
And I would just add sort of two comments or amplify or even give an opinion on the one with respect to the 5.92%. I mean, I do look at the 5.92% and say, that's below the average rate of inflation in 2022. And I do think a cap should not be below the rate of inflation.
Fair point.
So that, if there was some overarching, additional rule, it would be the cap is never below, CPI or something of that nature. And obviously for our listeners, it doesn't mean that every area would get the cap. The cap is just the limit. It doesn't mean that every area was affected by the cap. 87% or 86% were this year, but it's more just to say if the area median incomes as calculated by HUD based upon census data or at a rate greater than 5.92%, they ought to at least be able to go up to the rate to keep pace with inflation. So I would note that. And the other thing I would just note is in terms of the manner in which the rubber hits the road, if you will, with respect to the lack of predictability of these caps is really seen in private activity bond finance transactions that have financing gaps, and you're trying to come up with ways to close the financing gap so you can apply for bonds and start development. And to the extent that you can look at the census data and project what the income limits are going to be going forward a couple of years, you can then underwrite more operating income and as a consequence, support more bond debt such that the project can be financially feasible. And, if we have a reliable way of calculating the caps, we're able to come up with a better estimate as to what those income limits are going to be. They'll generally be a little bit higher, particularly in inflationary times. And as a consequence, more developments are financially feasible and more productivity bonds will be used to build affordable housing. Absent that, the way it's done now with the more conservative underwriting, there'd be fewer of those units that kind of get started. And you could say, well, eventually they'll get started, but you'd rather be starting to develop now, given the affordable housing shortage in the nation. But I'll get off my rant. And, we've talked about the fact that there was a different methodology used the last 2 years versus the prior 12. And in the article, we touch upon some alternative approaches to determining a cap. It's not like we settle on one, but, we do think a public discussion of a methodology for determining a cap should be held, and that the methodology should be transparent. But the existing methodology is transparent. The problem isn't transparency. The problem is predictability and reliability. So I think both you and I are of a mind that let's develop an approach, make it public, and know that that's the approach that will be used when the HUD calculates the income limits. So with that as kind of background, if you could share some of the approaches that we mentioned in the article or otherwise that we think should be considered, then I would note to our listeners, this is something that our income limits working group will be discussing in advance of potentially weighing in with HUD as to our thoughts.
Yeah. And so I actually really like the previous method that HUD used. And the reason why I like it is we're using the same input factors that we use with income limits. We're using the same ACS data and we're using the same CPI. And so that methodology to me, it really just caught outliers. It caught ones that are changing much larger than relative to the rest of the population. It seems, yeah, those should probably be the ones that are slowed down a little bit because we don't know why they're outliers, but they're clearly outliers. And so I really like the previous methodology of taking the ACS inflated by inflation and then looking at the double that year over year change. And I like the doubling factor, and I'm going to talk about that with the next one. I think the one other one that we suggested is double the change in CPI for the previous years. And now when Mike went on his rant earlier, he said, ought they be able to increase at least by CPI? And I think that, or inflation, and we're using CPI as a proxy of inflation here. And I think that limiting it to just inflation uh, will never allow a project to catch up if their increases happen later. And so if we have inflation for 3 years, but incomes in your area are slower to increase and then react to inflation later, if you're capped at inflation for that year, you never get a catch up for the years when inflation was higher than your growth. And that's why I think the doubling of inflation or some X factor of inflation, doubling, I think is nice. 1.5, if somebody wants to be, I don't know if there's going to be a give and take here with HUD, but I think that something where it allows you increase faster than inflation to account for the fact that often incomes respond later than inflation. And so allowing us to have that kind of trailing impact of doing that doubling is good. Or we could go back to kind of this original thought that we really should just be catching outliers. And so do we just define what percentage are outliers and say, okay, we're going to place the cap at whatever the top 10% of areas are. So you can increase, but anything that's above, the top 10 percentage increases, they're going to be capped at wherever that may be. And to me, that gets more to the point of we're really trying to capture outliers here, as opposed to the concept of large increases are bad. And I'm not sure I agree with that statement wholeheartedly that HUD has said. And large increases are bad in some cases and good in other cases, right? It's good for new projects. It's good for supporting tax exempt bonds. And so, placing a cap on the outliers, I think makes a lot more sense than just trying to have some sort of artificially created rent control here. And so those are the ones that I think make the most sense. We'd love to hear others. We'd love to have you send in your ideas. And obviously, we'd love to have you join the Income Limits Working Group and have a more robust discussion about what we think an appropriate cap would be.
Thank you for that, Thomas. And I appreciate you pointing out the the digital methodology of doubling the change in CPI, and that if you just use the CPI, then the years where you didn't get the height increase, you wouldn't be able to make up. So to make clear for listeners, as you know, I don't think it should just be the CPI.
Right.
That the CPI was, if you're going to have this other methodology, whatever other methodology you have, there ought to be this overriding that if that other methodology is below CPI, you should at least get CPI for that year.
Yeah.
But I'd also note, because I know a lot of developer clients listening to this podcast will be saying, Mike, I wish my costs were rising at CPI. We're hearing about how insurance costs are going up double digits, and diverse other operating expense line items are going up much faster than CPI.
Yeah.
So CPI isn't as if that is going to be enough per se on a given property. And ultimately, the one thing developers do agree to with property owners that like housing is that they can increase their rents at the rate of their median income rising. And we're just trying to look at the caps and say those caps were limiting what originally the statute said the rules were in terms of additional rent over time.
Yeah. So, Mike, if you want to get rid of the cap completely, but still have a cap, you'd cap it at 2 times the change in insurance cost. And your cap would be
That would not
50%
be
a
it.
year, right?
That would not be it, because the year when insurance costs fall a little bit and all the other costs
No.
rise. Yeah.
Yeah, the year that insurance costs fall, though, I'm sure developers are looking forward to that ever happening.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Yes, they
I'm
are.
being a little facetious there, obviously, but
Yep. No, obviously the percentage increases we're seeing in insurance the last 2 years aren't sustainable.
yeah.
Something will have to change, and there's efforts on that front as well. But we're going off on a tangent here. So now that we have the 2023 income limits and cap, we've talked about trying to weigh in with HUD about publicizing the cap methodology in advance and earlier. But as you and I have discussed, that doesn't mean developers, lenders, and investors should just sit on their hands until next year, when those 2024 income limits will be released. I thought it'd be useful if you share with our listeners some of the interim data that will be released, and, and with that interim data informing the 2024 income calculations. And if you could also share with listeners what resources are available to stay informed and influence possible changes.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with our income limit estimator. And so this is our calculation we do where we estimate future income limits. Now, HUD has all but publicly stated that they're going to use the 2022 ACS data for 2024 income limits. But we do have the 2021 ACS data, and we have a lot of areas that were capped. And so we've already updated our 2024 estimates using 2021 data and saying, hey, if 2022 is going to probably be better than 2021 in most areas, that this will kind of give you a baseline to say, well, we think we'll increase at least this much because we're kind of showing what areas are going to chew through this cap that they already have and how that cap impacts you. So we already have some data out there that's helping kind of inform areas we're looking at. But in September, we'll receive that 2022 American Community Survey data. And that's what we think HUD is going to use. And so people who subscribe to the estimator, as soon as we get that data, we're going to calculate the new cap. We're going to calculate the new income limits based on the 2022 method or 2023 methodology, and push those out to all of our users so that they'll be able to see, okay, what is this 2022 ACS data doing to our limits? And it'll also help us understand once we get that 2022 raw ACS data, we can compare that to the 2022 capped HUD data from last year and see, was this cap really needed? Are we seeing that actual incomes were increasing at similar to the rate of CPI growth? And that's going to also help us inform some of these conversations that, again, the income limit working group is going to have with HUD over the next coming months as we kind of give them our thoughts. Often it's us giving them our thoughts on uh, how the 2024 limits should be calculated. And HUD does a great job listening, and they are very present in these discussions. But often they don't tell us what they're planning to do yet because they have a whole host of other stakeholders that they have to worry about. And so that's that next interim data. We're going to get the 2022 ACS data and start updating the calculation then. And then, of course, come January, we'll get those final CPI numbers that HUD's going to be using. So all this data is going to help get this more informed picture of how 2024 is going to look, but also help us inform how we should be interacting with HUD, how we should be, potentially, I don't like the word lobbying, but lobbying with HUD as to what the correct income limit should be, and also seeing if there's, or what the correct cap should be, and also seeing if there's a need to reach outside of HUD to do more discussion with other stakeholders to figure out what the right answer is here. So this next year, there's going to be a lot of data coming in, and it's going to really help us know do we need to, really get out there and lobby HUD, or do we think the cap's going to be sufficient? Are areas stagnating? We don't know these answers yet, but it's going to be really informed kind of come September.
And in terms of the rent income limit estimator, uh, what will you be doing with respect to the cap?
Yeah. So
Have a pre-2022 methodology and a 2022 and 2023 methodology.
So right now we're looking at doing continuing the 2022-2023 methodology, because that's basically what HUD has told us they plan to do at our working group calls and at NCSHA in front of, bigger groups. They've kind of said this methodology seems to be working. But I think when we get that 2022 data, as we discussed earlier, the fact that we see that HUD is using this more as a way to smooth increases than necessarily to catch outliers, that if that 2022 data comes back with a cap that's 25%, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm probably not going to be comfortable using that as our cap, right?
Right.
So somewhat that, and that's what we got. That's that whole discussion earlier about this unpredictability of the cap, that it is going to cause us to pause anytime we're seeing double digit average increases to say, okay, what is tolerable for HUD, and what are they going to do with this? And so we'll probably end up calculating it both ways, the old way, the new way,
Right.
and seeing what that cap is. And also when we send out the limits, we'll say, here's the cap that we used, but we don't know if HUD will use a lower number. And if they use a higher cap, well, good. You're getting more than you were anticipated, and that's always better. But so it's going to be a little bit more of an iterative process and more discussion on it than there's been in the past.
It's definitely almost more of a pre-cap number and a post-cap number
Right, right. There's that too, right? Yeah,
because you just don't know what the cap will be. But hopefully, we'll there'll be some discussion of the cap in advance of the release, and we'll get some predictability. That'll take time.
yeah. And that's one thing, we really talked to HUD about that. You know, when they this year for 2023 income limits, right? They couldn't use the 2020 ACS data because it wasn't available. Census didn't release it. And HUD did a great job of telling us early what they were planning to do. I think we've really been hammering that message that, if you're going to change the cap again, letting us know as early as possible is great. And especially if you're taking public comment on it, so that we as an industry can prepare for that and be able to have a more robust and informed discussion with them about the cap ahead of time.
So, Thomas, let me thank you for spending time today to go through these details. There's so much more we could talk about. We only have so much time.
Right.
And then to our listeners, as Thomas said, the income limit estimator will be updated after the American Community Survey data release in September. And Thomas will be writing a blog post about the data. And if you subscribe to the rent income limit estimator, you'll get updated information. And if you're not already subscribing, I'd encourage you to reach out to Thomas and become a subscriber. I'll also include a link to this month's column in today's show notes, the column that Thomas and I wrote on this issue. Thomas, as you know, please stick around for our off mic section. I get to ask you some fun off topic questions. Now, turning to next week, be sure to tune in next week. I should say, be sure to tune in the next 2 weeks for a special discussion on the overall tax equity market. I'm going to have 3 of my partners joining me. That's right. This is a first. We haven't had 3 guests before. The 3 guests will be my partners, Brad Elphick, Dirk Wallace, and Tony DePony. They'll join me in this discussion of the market for tax credit equity. Over the 2 podcasts, we're going to discuss the size of the various tax credit equity markets. When I say tax credit equity markets, I'm going to be particularly focused on the low-income housing tax credit, new markets tax credit, renewable energy tax credits, and the historic tax credits, these equity markets around these credits. We'll also look, or I should say, we're going to look at how each of them affect each other, as well as how proposals to expand and enhance some of these incentives could affect the size of the equity market and then correspondingly the pricing. In addition to talking about the size of current equity markets and proposals to expand existing credits, we'll also talk about proposed tax incentives, think neighborhood homes, think middle income housing tax credit, and the effect that they could have on the overall tax-free equity market. And then we're also going to discuss some of the seemingly unrelated issues that have a direct impact on tax credit equity pricing. Things like the general economy, the global minimum tax, community reinvestment regulations. All of these have an indirect effect on community development tax credit equity pricing. And now you can see it took me a while to discuss what we're going to discuss. So you now know why it'll take us 2 episodes to cover these variety of tax credits in the tax credit equity market more generally and each of the areas more specifically. It's going to be a very interesting discussion that will benefit stakeholders in any community development area. So once again, 2-part podcast series starting next week. And maybe most importantly, if there are questions that you think we should cover in these 2 episodes, please email me at cpas@novoco.com. Now I'm pleased to reach our off-mic section where I get to ask Thomas for some fun off-topic recommendation and get some words of wisdom from him. So Thomas, you've been a guest on the podcast quite often, but don't worry, I haven't run out of questions. There are new questions, I believe. You can correct me if I'm wrong, if I don't remember correctly. And, podcast listeners know, and you know that starting with the pandemic, I got back to reading a lot more books or listening to them on Audible. And I'm always looking for book recommendations. So what book would you recommend to me and or our listeners?
Well, Mike, so I'm heading to Montana at the end of next week. So I'm going to recommend A River Runs Through It. Now, I've actually never seen the movie, but I've read the book many times. The book is great. It's a great look at uh, life and family and relationships and everything like that. But I'm going to leave everybody with a quote that I like from it that isn't one of the more popular quotes. And it is, "One reason Paul caught more fish than anyone else was that he had his flies in the water more than anyone else. Brother," he would say, "there are no flying fish in Montana. Out here, you can't catch fish with your flies in the air." And you can probably guess a lot of reasons why I like that quote, but it just always reminds me that sometimes we just need to get to work, and whether it's work or spending time with your family or whatever, you just need to get out there and get your fly in the water, and you'll be more likely to catch fish.
So I do like that quote a lot. So I had not recalled that quote from the book. It's been a while since I've read it. So it's probably worth rereading. And you should watch the movie at some point.
I should. Maybe on my drive to Montana, but not when I'm driving.
I was going to say, just as long as you're not driving. So my second question, we're starting our fall conference season uh, well after Labor Day. It'll be the Novogradac Housing Tax Credit and Bonds Conference. It'll be in New Orleans, and it's at the end of September 28th to 29th. I always like to ask guests what tips they have to get the most out of one of our conferences. So what are some of your tips?
I think there's a couple of things. I think number one is really being open to the experience, right? And so being open to going to a session that maybe you hadn't thought about before, that's going to teach you something new and learn something new from it. And being open to kind of meeting new people and talking to new people. And maybe that goes back to my earlier quote, right? Get your fly in the water and meet somebody new. But my true life advice for the New Orleans conference is schedule a later flight home on Friday and find somebody new at the conference. And on Friday afternoon, take them to Cafe Du Monde to get some beignets. Don't eat inside Cafe Du Monde, but walk up and eat beignets overlooking the Mississippi. It's really a great chance to sit back and reflect on the conference, reflect on your hopefully new people that you met there, and just a good time to enjoy life. And that's my favorite thing to do at the New Orleans conference, aside from hearing Mike give the Washington Wire, of course.
Well, thank you for that. That's a great tip. And I can visualize it right now. So I may be following up on that tip. There might be a lot of podcast listeners
Up there, we'll have our old.
looking over the Mississippi.
Yes.
I can visualize it very well. And I would say in terms of probably a tip that builds off of that is you can download the app in advance. And the app lists various attendees, and you can actually reach out to attendees in advance of the conference through the conference app to set up those meetings. So that could be a nice way to plan in advance of the conference, folks that you want to make sure that you meet with. So that would be an added tip, but thank you for that, Thomas.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas. And to our listeners, I'm Mike Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.